Okay. Hey, sorry. I have had nothing but technical issues for the past several days. And then it was also the weekend. And so the weekend's always full of stuff. I'm going to keep this as brief as possible. My hope is to be done with this in 15 minutes, mostly because I'm trusting that y'all read the articles. But you'll find that they're very repetitive or redundant from what you read in the Cooper chapter. So if you read that chapter, which most of you did, and if you didn't, go back and review it because it's, again, when we were talking about this at the beginning of class, like at the beginning of our course, that chapter goes through everything that you're going to need to know for this class. So I'm going to share on my screen real quick just to go through these articles. See, there we go. Beautiful. So this one is Schlinger and Norman. It's a 2013 article, and this is talking about the origins of functional analysis. Where did it come from? How did we get this idea? You'll find that in the 80s and 90s, Iwata and actually Greg Hanley were pretty big in developing what we would call the functions of behavior, and how, more importantly, how to test for the functions of behavior. So real quick, I want everybody to pause this if you can, and then just name the 4 functions of behavior. Okay, cool. So attention, tangible, escape, and so there are what we would call like little sub things in there as well, because sometimes like there is an escape to something else, right? And that's where we would talk about like that PFA. Sometimes it is just genuinely just like the escape from certain types of demands, right? Sometimes when we talk about automatic, it might be automatic from the like sensory avoidance, but it might also be sensory seeking, could also be talking about medical issues. And this would also be where we would bump in if there is something else that might be where we have like a history of trauma, or we also might have a history of other sorts of diagnoses, like mental health diagnoses that could be affecting some part, right, within the contingencies of behavior. And last week, well, what would have been last week's class, we talked about testing those contingencies, right? So that is one way to test for the function of a behavior. Another way to do it is to test the antecedent. So that's where we would come up with these 4 different conditions within an experimental functional analysis. So with this particular article, it is actually a really great one for talking about just like the basics of what a functional analysis is. So I highly encourage you to go into that. I would also say, let's go into this next one, which is the Iwata article. So we're going to switch to the clinical application of functional analysis methodology. This one has a lot of meat in it. So it's a 7-page article that really goes through quite a bit of information about the term functional analysis, how we test for functional analysis, why we're testing, are we looking for. And then what I also really like about this one is that it does talk about these constraints. So the chief limitations of a typical FA include constraints of time. Some of y'all do have time issues that we're having to work with, right? So I would say that if you're in a classroom setting, you're not going to be able to do a full experimental functional analysis. It's not going to work out because the environment and the time constraints within that environment are not going to allow it. So on Thursday, we're going to talk about what might be a better tool to use, which would be the brief FA or the PFA. And we've talked a lot about the PFA already as part of Greg Hanley's work, right? So some of the other constraints that I talked about, which was something we talked about last week's class, which is the risk posed by severe problem behavior. So if it's severe self-injury, severe aggression, you're not going to do an experimental FA for that. You are going to do something that's not going to lead you to that type of behavior. You're going to test that precursor, right? And just measure those precursors of behaviors that might be happening. When we talk about the PFA, we're going to talk about how we've got R1, R2 behaviors. R2 behaviors is what you're going to measure, right? The less severe behavior, as opposed to the R1, which is that severe problem behavior. We're going to try not to test on those. We're going to try not to evoke those behaviors. Okay, cool. So this article also goes into the brief FA, what we were just talking about. So if you've got some time constraints, you might have to do that, right? But you also have some really great data here. These are actually some fantastic data to support FAs. That's why FAs are still considered the gold standard. This is also why there was the need, all those constraints that we just listed before, proposes that need for this type of synthesized reinforcement, as well as thinking about the fact that sometimes it's escaped to something else, or it's not quite tangible, but it is also tangible, or it's not that specific tangible, it's this other specific tangible. Or maybe it's because I want the attention plus the escape from demand, which is usually what I see the most often. Okay. So again, it goes into our potential dangerous behaviors, what you can do instead if you've got limited control over the environmental conditions. So talking about classroom conditions, right? This is a really fantastic article to read. In other words, if you haven't read an article, this would be the one that I would choose to read. Okay. I hope I'm really clear about that one. Beautiful. It's fantastic. Okay, so now we're not going to go into anything that's pertaining to next class, but what I would like to do is I would like to say it's time to decide what type of FA you're going to be doing, what kind of FBA are you going to be doing, and why. So after you've watched this video, send me a quick email that just says what type of functional analysis you're going to be doing and why. And that why can be because I'm in the classroom, because of the severity of their problem behavior, because I feel really strongly about what their precursors are, whatever it might be. Give me the reason why, and we can go from there. And then here's the other thing too. You're just being graded on, did you complete this? Did you send me what you'd like to do for your FA? It doesn't mean that when we talk, you can't change your mind. So, but just go ahead and let me know what you're thinking and where your minds are going with this project so that we can move forward. And then on Thursday, we're going to go through the rubric together so that if you would like to get started on writing, you can get started on writing, especially if you've already got an idea of what that background information is. But then keep this in mind. You may not do any part of the assessment, whether it's the interview, the indirect, the observation, any of that. You may not do it until you have informed consent by the caregivers. And we aren't talking about informed consent from the caregivers for another 2 weeks. So just be aware of that, okay? All right. Please email me if you have any questions. I'm going to make sure that we've got this link uploaded to Moodle as well. But it's embedded in your email right now. Okay. Thanks so much, y'all. See you on Thursday.